Hey there, everybody. Mr. Lewis here, ready to go through section 3 of Unit 5 in AP Micro today. Perfectly competitive factor markets. This is one of two types of factor markets we'll see, the other being a monopsony, and we'll look at that in section 4. So, in a perfectly competitive factor market, or PCFM, we'll abbreviate it, we have individual firms who are not producers, they're actually consumers in this case. Right? So there's two big things we need to know about these individual firms. One, they are going to pay the wage that's set in the market. They are wage takers. Just like in a perfectly competitive product market where individual firms are charging the same price that's set in the market, individual firms in a PCFM are going to offer the same wage that's set in the market. The other big thing we need to know about individual firms in a PCFM is they're still going to apply this marginal principle, hiring the quantity of labor where the marginal factor cost of that labor is equal to the marginal revenue product. When it really boils down to it, we're not going to pay more for a unit of labor than what they're bringing us in. So let's look at these two graphs. On the left, we have the labor market, and on the right, we have the individual firm. In the market, we have a positively sloped supply curve and a negatively sloped demand curve. The reason the supply curve is positively sloped is because as individual firms, we have to pay more and more and more and more, or move up on the y-axis in order to attract more and more laborers. And each individual laborer on this supply curve has a certain willingness to accept. Some people way down here on the supply curve are willing to accept very low wages, whereas up here, they demand a bit higher of a wage in order to come work in this particular market. The demand curve is negatively sloped. So what we end up with is this nice easy equilibrium in the market that determines the market wage, WM, and the market quantity, QM. That wage then carries over to the individual firm, and they are going to establish that wage and continue to offer the same wage, and therefore we have a perfectly elastic supply curve. We have a constant marginal factor cost that results in a perfectly elastic or perfectly horizontal supply curve. In a perfectly competitive product market, this resulted in a perfectly elastic demand curve, right? In this case, it's supply. So what does our demand curve look like? It's just negatively sloped. It's actually a linear curve. It's negatively sloped. And remember, it corresponds to the marginal revenue product as well. So basically, if you aren't bringing enough money in, we're going to be less likely to hire you. And what we see is that there's this nice, easy, identifiable point where marginal factor cost is equal to marginal revenue product. We are not going to hire beyond that point. We'll continue to hire all the workers up until this point, but if we continue beyond that, check out what happens. Our marginal factor cost is still up here at WF, right? This is the wage offered by the firm now. But our marginal revenue product continues to go down because we're hiring more and more workers. We're digging into the labor pool, maybe not hiring as effectively, or maybe we're just experiencing diminishing returns. Really, all of those things are factors here. But the point is, we're getting less out of all of these additional workers now beyond QF than what we're paying. So we're going to stop right there. Now, a big thing to understand before I show a little bit more detail about these graphs, individual firms in a perfectly competitive factor market aren't necessarily the same firms that are operating in a perfectly competitive product market. They might be hiring in a perfectly competitive labor market, but selling their product in an imperfect market. I just want to make sure we understand that. Now, looking a little bit closer at these two graphs, pretty easy to identify the market wage and quantity, and you already practiced a little bit with moving the supply curve and the demand curve around and seeing what the consequences are there. But the individual firm isn't so bad either, right? Especially compared to, I feel, a perfectly competitive product market. We only have two curves. One is already established from the market wage, and the other one is just negatively sloped, and they're both linear. And there's one point where they meet, so pretty easy to identify that quantity, that profit maximizing or optimal quantity of labor for the individual firm. But we still have consumer surplus in the market, We still have producer surplus in the market. I don't want you to forget that those things are identified and calculated in exactly the same way. So if you're asked about consumer surplus in a labor market or producer surplus, don't freak out. Okay, we look at it the same way. Consumer surplus falls along the demand curve, and producer surplus falls along the supply curve. In the individual firms graph, we also have consumer surplus because they are the consumers. They're buying labor all the way up to this point. And then this rectangular area here, we have wage and we have our quantity of labor. So if we know how many workers we're hiring and we know what we're paying each of them, this area can help us identify and calculate the total cost of that labor. So just a few things there that I wanted to point out because they will be in your checkpoint to go with this section. The final thing that I want to discuss with any type of firm in a factor market, it doesn't just have to be in a perfectly competitive factor market, it could be a monopsony. There's this situation where we might be asked how a firm finds the optimal combination. So if it's just one type of factor of production, we use the marginal principle clear cut. But what if we want to know the best combination of two different factors of production, two different inputs? This actually goes back to section 1.6 in the first unit of the course. And you can click on this link to open up those notes if you like, but I'm going to show you some things here. This goes back to utility theory that we studied at the very beginning of the year. And utility theory helped us identify the consumer equilibrium, where consumers were maximizing benefits when trying to buy a combination of two things. Well, guess what? We have a consumer situation here, right? Individual firms and factor markets are consumers. They're paying for something. So let's say we're buying machines and paying for laborers. If we want to know what the optimal combination is, we're going to use this equimarginal rule. The two rules of the equimarginal rule or consumer equilibrium were we have to max out our budget. That's not going to be too much of an issue here, as you'll see. The bigger thing was consuming the combination at which marginal utility per dollar of the last unit consumed of each good was equal. In other words, if we're hiring 4 workers and we buy or rent, pay for 5 machines, then we want the bang per buck of the 4th worker and the 5th machine to be equal. In the case of factor markets, bang per buck is simply marginal product divided by the wage, or whatever we pay for that factor of production. So this is when we looked at these kind of charts where we had units consumed, total utility, marginal utility, and then bang per buck, right? Marginal benefit per dollar. And then we found where they were equal, and then we tried to max out our budget, and we came up with some combination where we were maximizing our utility. We're going to do the same thing with factor markets. So the question is, how does a firm find the optimal combination of two different inputs? The rule is the profit maximizing, or in other words, cost minimizing, combination of any two inputs is where the last dollar spent on each input yields the same amount of marginal product. In other words, the combination at which the bang per buck is equal. So we already determined how many units we want to produce, right? Now we're trying to figure out what's the best combination of factors to get to that quantity. So here's an example AP question. It says a firm is currently employing a cost minimizing combination of labor and capital. So they're already doing the best they can. We know they're cost minimizing. They're applying these principles that we just discussed on the previous slides. The firm is employing 20 workers, and the marginal product of the last worker is 40 units. Now that 20 workers isn't really a big deal. What's more important is the marginal product of the last worker. That's our bang, right? That's the benefit in terms of product, 40 units. The firm is employing 100 units of capital, and the marginal product of the last unit of capital is 10 units of output. So we have our marginal product there as well. The wage rate is $20 per hour. So what is the price of capital? We know that the firm is already cost minimizing. So they're just asking us, what must we be paying for that capital in order for this to be a cost minimizing situation? So we know we have $20 per hour. What we can do then is take that 40, the marginal product of the last worker, divide by the $20 per hour we're paying them, and that gives us a bang per buck of 2 units per dollar, right? And we can just set that equal to now a fraction. We know that that has to be equal to the marginal product of the last unit of capital, 10 units of output, divided by whatever we're paying for it. In other words, 2 is equal to 10 over what? And the answer is $5. And guess what? That is one of our options. It's answer B, and that is the correct answer. So we're just applying that utility theory, the consumer equilibrium, to a factor market in this case. So in order for you to apply these skills and practice these skills, there's a checkpoint in Buzz, the 5.3 checkpoint. It is 10 questions long. You have unlimited attempts, and there's good feedback in there, so pay attention to that. If you have any other questions, or if something comes up that you just need a little bit more of a detailed explanation, I am here to help, so feel free to reach out. Otherwise, go get that checkpoint done and have a terrific weekend. All right, thanks everyone. See you next time.